Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Nice to see such a large crowd. I'm TK Daniel, past president of our group. And today we have a fantastic presentation. You already saw the title, Medical School Admissions, A Look Behind the Curtain. And our speaker today is Dr. Mark DeBard, who is currently Professor Emeritus of Clinical Emergency Medicine at Ohio State, at the Ohio State College of Medicine, having retired in 2016 after 40 years as an emergency physician, the last 15 years at Ohio State. Dr. DeBard served on the American College of Emergency Physicians Board of Directors from 1992 to 1998, Vice Speaker from 1999 to 2003, and as Speaker from 2003 to 2005. He is a winner of the Wittgenstein Award, ACP's highest award. Dr. DeBard has served for 18 years on the Ohio State College of Medicine Admissions Committee, including 4 years as its co-chair. Dr. DeBard remains active as an applicant screener, interviewer, and deliberator. In addition, his main retirement hobby is lilac horticulture. Dr. DeBard.
Now you should be able to hear me. So who was here a couple years ago when I talked about lilacs? All right, a couple people, all right. So I promise you an update in a couple more years maybe, right? But today it's my other retirement hobby, which is medical school admissions. How many in here are MDs or DOs, just for fun? Oh, a handful. It's not your medical school admissions process anymore like we went through years ago. It's very different. And I'm going to update you on that today. Hopefully the rest of you may have some interest in your family members. I had one lady, Joan, back there who talked to me about her granddaughter being a senior in high school and wondering which college does it make a difference. And others have other relatives that may be going into it. There's a lot to learn about going to medical school, for that matter, any professional school these days. I've been privileged to be involved in that process the last 18 years. And I'd like to tell you about what is involved in the process and what's changed over the years as well. I appreciate the Zoom audience today. I think I saw our chair who is zooming in from Buenos Aires, Argentina today, Ardeen Nelson. So hi, Ardeen, wherever you are up there on the screen, and appreciate you zooming in today with us as well. All right, let's get started. Because the screen's so big, I'm going to be in the back a bit. Since I've got the portal microphone on, we won't need to do it any other way. So there are many paths to getting into medical school, and this was one of the paths for a long time. That is, guaranteed admission was offered to medical school at the end of high school. So that was true for about 5% of entering classes up through the year 2000 in the United States. Guaranteed admission at the end of high school, whether or not you completed a bachelor's degree in those days as well. That's gone. Both at OSU and almost all USA medical schools. They just don't do that anymore. Interestingly enough, I was in Korea in October for a LILAC conference, and they told me that the only way to get into medical school in South Korea is by acceptance at the end of high school. Guaranteed acceptance. You don't get in later. You have to decide at the end of high school. A very different process, and let me tell you, it would result in a lot of different results than we have in the US as well. I see that there are some issues even today in South Korea. You may be reading about the strike that they're having over increasing or decreasing their conditions and their numbers. It's very problematic there, and I don't think we're faced with those kind of problems here. There was also the so-called early decision program, which we had here at Ohio State. And it was offering early medical school acceptance on the condition that the applicant completed their bachelor's degree satisfactorily. Luckily, the word satisfactorily was in there as well because there were issues with some of these people. And the issue involved attributes more than their metrics. And that makes sense because frankly, they were accepted basically on the premise that their scores in high school were excellent. And that's how they got their early decision. And that's not what being a doctor is just about. That's only part of it. And so we noticed some problems with their personal attributes developing or not developing in college. In addition, they didn't have as much motivation to get some experiences that we like to see our applicants have. So they sort of became less qualified as they went through college. The other problem is that almost all of these offered students were white and affluent. And that resulted in a lot less diversity in the class. And they also let this program continue probably longer than it should have because it improved the medical school's rankings. So if the percentage of accepted students who actually enrolled or matriculated is high, then the medical school is considered very desirable. Well, of course, these students were not only offered, they were guaranteed acceptance, and they signed guarantee that they would not go anywhere else. That was part of the deal. They were committed from the beginning. So the acceptance and matriculation rates were identical, 100%. And that looked real good on the medical school statistics. But really, there was no intrinsic educational value to us offering this kind of program. And there are lots of drawbacks, as you see from what happened. Then there's legacy admissions, which still exist. So legacy admissions are favored admission status for children of alumni and sometimes for current employees and also sometimes for president of the university or dean of the medical school favorites and sometimes for wealthy donors is what happens with legacy admissions. It's used by about 75% of medical schools in one form or another. Most of them are considered private and elite and can get away with doing that. Not so much true with the public schools. The form it takes is usually these people are granted an automatic interview. And as you're going to see, getting an interview is key to getting into medical school. And only if that interview went badly wrong would they not get into medical school. They were actually called red dots. It's kept very quiet and private, but it existed. The AMA has officially opposed legacy admissions as of 2022. OSU discontinued them around 2015 to some mild resistance. But by and large, it went over pretty well. We took a lot of trouble to talk to people who had family members coming into med school that may have been alumni and teach them how to do it right and get in. And they seemed to accept it pretty well. It was also felt to discriminate against first generation or low income students, people of color and immigrants as well, who obviously were not candidates for legacy admissions based on the criteria that you see there. There have been racial and ethnic considerations in the admissions process. That is now gone. But I thought you might like to know how it was used during the years that it was used. Up through 2022, over the last, up to that point, 20 years or so before that, it was used as a tiebreaker among equally qualified candidates. The admissions committees of most medical schools are pretty committed to the principle that the ethnic and racial makeup of doctors in America should look just like the racial and ethnic makeup of America. I personally think that's a great idea. You have to be able to do it legally, though. And at that time, the way you did it legally was to use it as a tiebreaker among equally qualified candidates, which was legally acceptable at the time. The problem came in what was equally qualified. As you'll see, we had scores ranging from 1 to 5, 1 being superior, 2 being excellent, 3 strong, 4 acceptable, 5 not acceptable. And if you have a committee that finally votes of 12 people, 1/10 of a point is 1 vote on that committee. So is someone who has a 1.9 equally qualified as someone that has a 2.0? Or is a 1.5 equal to 2.5? Do they do equally well in medical school? Do they make equally good doctors? Well, that was a point open for debate and often a contentious point. So here's the makeup right now in this year's class that started medical school this year. We had 7,229 applications out of over 50,000 in the country. That 7,000 got down to 670 interviews that were granted. Out of that, 383 people were accepted, and out of those, 198 actually came to Ohio State. 9% of them were first-generation college students. 16% had a physician parent, which is probably similar to who goes into most occupations. More interesting is the expansion of growth years. So a growth year, previously called a gap year, if you will, is what happens after you graduate from college before you go to medical school. So now 50% of our applicants take a growth year of 1 and 36% take 2 years. There's certainly advantages to that, and we'll discuss that a little bit later. But the point being that we have now reached the point where most of our applicants are taking growth years, which is a big, big change from the past. Certainly when I got into medical school, that was probably 1% would be the best number I could come up with. To get into OSU, you have to do research 99% of the time. So we do take some that have never done any research, but it's pretty rare. OSU values knowledge of research and research processes. And it has a score, and to get into us, if you have 0 on research, that's 1/12 of your total score that you're missing. And it's pretty hard to overcome that. 1/12 makes a big difference in getting into medical school. A lot of graduate degrees, various types of masters, masters of science, master of arts. We don't necessarily pay a lot of attention to those in terms of consideration. The age range was 20 to 46 this last year. We also do not take age into consideration. We have actually admitted 17-year-olds who have to be 18 by the time they start medical school. And so it is possible to do, but it's incredibly rare. It's definitely a Doogie Howser situation. And it only comes about with, I hate to use the word genius applicant because there's so much more to it than that. They basically have to have an entire college experience, both academics and experiences, along with the personal attributes, all done through high school, which can happen, but it's incredibly rare, incredibly rare. So the median age, though, is as you would expect in the 23 to 24 range. Lots of languages spoken that represents the broad distribution of applicants that we have as well. I thought the percentage of women in various categories might interest you. In 1972, when I entered medical school, they accounted for 8% of the matriculants in my class here at Ohio State. So 92% men in that class. In 2007, women received 50% of all the bachelor degrees and 60% of the biology bachelor degrees in the country. But of those graduates, for the women, 2.2% applied to med school versus 3.2% of men, which pretty much accounted for the discrepancy that you see in 2011 there, where women were 42% of our applicants, 39% of our interviewees, and 45% of our matriculants, placing us behind the nation at 47% at that time. In 2023, women are 54% of our matriculants and it has been stable at that number for at least the last 5 years. And that represents kind of the future of medicine at this point in time. Part of that rise I attribute to our equal consideration of personal attributes, which for whatever reason, the women we interview seem to have a lot of great personal attributes that we value in medicine. And that seems to help favor them in the admissions process. Geographic origin, mostly the eastern US and West Coast, along with Utah. We have a pipeline from Brigham Young for reasons that aren't clear to all of us. But we do have a large Mormon population in Ohio, and that may have something to do with that. Those from Ohio were 90% of our matriculants when I got into med school. Today, they're 54%. And note that the applicants, only 16% are from Ohio. So there's a distinct advantage to being an Ohioan who's applying to medical school at Ohio State. Up until about 1992, the state legislature wanted us to have about 90% Ohioans at Ohio State Medical School. I understand that that time that they went to the legislature, it says, well, we understand you want the best doctors in Ohio. Do you want the best doctors in the country? And if so, we're going to have to admit more people from out of state. And the legislature decided they wanted the best doctors in the country coming to Ohio State and permitted us to have a target of 50%. And that's kind of our informal target today, 50% from Ohio. The average GPA of this year's class is 3.80 with a science GPA of 3.74. So good, maybe even great. But GPAs don't seem to mean quite as much as they used to. The schools all around the country have very similar GPAs. They seem to give A's a lot easier than they used to. And it's pretty hard to compare from one school to the next. Some are harder graders than others. That's why the MCAT is still used. Our composite MCAT percentile was 90th percentile at the 515 level. I'll explain that more to you later. Average MCAT of matriculants is a statistic that all the med schools in the country follow very closely and are a big part of the USA Today type rankings and are controversial. So the med school application process, college, you got to do 4 years in general. This is the typical process. You can get in after 2 years if you have enough experiences. It's rare. 50% now take 1 or 2 growth years after college. This primary advantage of this is that you can increase your experiences, which gives you a competitive advantage compared to other applicants who are basing their application on experiences through 3 years of college. So there's a good reason why these kids are doing it more these days. In addition, it can allow time for a better academic performance. You can get your senior year grades counted in your application. You can do some post-bac work that might impress the committee as well. And that's become pretty common as well. Most people take their MCAT in the mid to the end of the junior year, and they apply between June 1st and November 1st for the following year's entering class, usually in August or so in the summertime. So this is an overview of how we do it. We get about 7,000 applications. About 5,000 of those will be offered a secondary app and complete it. And we will then screen those 5,000 applications and get it down to a number somewhere, and I don't have this number for an actual fact, but it's personal best guess around 1,800 that are worthy of interviews. Out of that 1,800, we invite about 650 to be interviewed. They've been stratified during the screening process, and we do choose some from each of those categories based on what we want to see at our medical school. Most of the superiors, indeed, probably all the superiors will get an interview. About 75% of the outstandings will, 10% of the strongs, and really none of the acceptables, or obviously the rejects. So we interview 650, we'll accept about 345 and defer about 300, reject maybe 5 with extremely bad scores for whatever reason. Don't forget, though, that there are other pathways to getting into medical school, and we're going to mention those later. This is the primary majority interview process, but not the only way you get into medical school. The size of our classes is limited by the available clinical rotations in the 3rd and 4th year. This is how, say, some of the Caribbean medical schools that have only 2 years in the island nation have classes of 500 or 1,000. It's cash on the line and they have big auditoriums. Anybody can go to lectures. But getting the clinical experiences, they have to come back to the United States, and that's where the difficulty is. And the same is true here. We could have easily twice as many enter medical school, but we wouldn't have room for them during the clinical rotations. So in the past, OBGYN has been our most limited rotation in terms of numbers. And so there's always going to be some specialty that has the least available space for training students. And that's pretty much why we limit it to the number that we have. Of those 205, about 170 come in through the interview process, but there are other slots open for the medical science training program, the MD PhD program, a special post-bac program that's called MedPath, which I won't get into today. And we now have special entrance programs for family medicine and community medicine, the latter having just been started in last year. Next year, we're going to have 224 students in the entering class. This is primarily due to the expansion of the community medicine program, which is going to have a lot of faculty in Lima, Ohio, which will also be offering their clinical rotations, is the way they're able to expand it. It's a program that is focused on family practice, public health, and taking care of more rural communities. So general practice in the old parlance, if you will. Beyond that, I don't know. So think about what it costs to get into medical school for some of these applicants. One school's application is $175 plus 45 for each additional school. Secondary applications cost money as well, $80 in OSU's case. So a lot of money just to apply to medical schools. And how many do you need to apply to? We'll talk about that. If you apply to any less than 10 or 15 schools, you're increasing the role of luck. There is a substantial amount of luck in this process. This is not an objective process around the country. Sometimes it's how well you come off an interview. It depends what mood your screener was in that day, or if it's somebody who likes the way you write versus somebody who doesn't like the way you write. These are very subjective factors that can't be done away with. And so the good applicant will know this and account for the role of luck by applying to at least 10 or 15 schools. They'll always apply to their in-state school where they have a better chance of getting in, like they do at Ohio State if you're an Ohioan. And they'll also apply to their undergraduate home medical school if they attended, because we have a soft spot for Ohio State undergraduates who graduate from Ohio State. It's just the way it is. They also need to be applying to schools for whom their academic metrics are in range. So they have this information on a report called the Medical Student Admissions Report that MCAT sells to them. And they can find out schools' average GPAs, MCAT scores, things like that. And they're given advice on which ones that they should apply to that are within range for them, including ones they're almost certain to get into and a few reach schools, but most of them clustered in the middle. Then after they've gotten to those, they can select some out-of-state schools that are relatively friendly to outsiders. So as an example of unfriendly to outsiders is University of Texas, which takes almost only people from Texas universities. And there's really no reason for somebody from Ohio to apply to a Texas university because you're not going to get in. And you got to find out that stuff ahead of time before you waste your time and money. Also, if there's something about their application making them less than competitive, you need to apply to a lot more than 15 schools. We frequently advise them to apply to 30 to 35 medical schools, and think about the expense of that that we're getting up to. So these are all the program types that they can apply to around the country, and most of them here at Ohio State. The regular MD program, which is what I've been talking about, the MSTP, MD PhD program. There is a 6-year program possibility in many schools around the country. Combinations with MPHs and MBAs. They can actually request deferred or delayed matriculation, which there's always a couple each year that do this for various reasons, and they're usually granted if they have a good reason. And then there's other special programs, like I mentioned, the family practice and community medicine. So they all have similar pathways, but separate from the regular admission process. Then a lot of the students interested in applying ask me about applying to MD versus DO schools. And this is what I tell them. I tell them that the training is nearly identical. Osteopaths get extra training in manipulation therapy. The osteopathic schools accept students with slightly lower metrics, and their overall reputation still today is not as high as MD schools. On the other hand, their post-graduation residency training opportunities are identical. Anybody can get into anybody else's residency, which is not the way it used to be. DOs couldn't get into MD residencies, MDs couldn't get into DOs. That's pretty much gone away. So because of that, in actual practice, there's not much difference between what MDs and DOs do and what specialties they go into, other than DOs tend to have a bent towards more family medicine and community medicine residency programs. It's also a little extra stuff you have to do to get into osteopathic schools compared to MD schools, with the essay about why osteopathy and a recommendation from a DO as well in your letters. These are the pitfalls I tell the students about in applying to medical school. Not applying to enough of them, not applying to the right ones, which I just went over with you. Applying too late in the cycle or taking too long to send in the secondary. The earlier you get considered, the better your chances are. A re-applicant, somebody who didn't get in the first time, not waiting long enough to improve their application, whatever the weakness was in their application. A lot of them will apply the very next year and they haven't really done anything to improve the application. That's a big mistake and an expensive mistake. Taking the MCAT before you're ready to take it, particularly if you haven't had enough of the courses that the MCAT tests on. Repeating an MCAT without changing your study process or your preparation process is a mistake, because the MCAT's pretty reliable unless you change what you do. And the all-important personal statement, if it doesn't emphasize that they want to be a doctor, you'd be surprised how many actually don't actually say that in their personal statement. And then tell us not only why you want to be a doctor, but tell me how it happened that you came to want to be a doctor. I have to understand your thought process to rate you highly on that personal statement. Be sure you really want to be a doctor. This year, there were some new features in the application. Work and activities have a new experience entitled Social Justice and Advocacy. We used to have a category called disadvantaged status that's been basically replaced with, quote, other impactful experiences. Institutional actions, which we keep track of, have been divided into conduct and academic actions. So academic, I was placed on probation for a semester due to low grades my freshman first semester. We don't see that as big a problem as we do conduct, like I was caught drinking in my dorm room or something like that. So we differentiate those a little bit. And they basically made it a policy. Everybody has to know that it takes them 6 to 8 weeks to verify applications after you submit it. It takes them a long time. They do background checks as well. After they get conditional acceptances after January 1st, that costs money. The students do see that first, and they can tell them not to submit it to the medical school, in which case their application will be withdrawn. But they do have that option. I do tell the applicants, though, that once they're accepted to medical school, the medical schools do their own background checks, and you do not have a right to see that one, and they can do anything they want with it. A good example is drugs. Medical school, hospitals can screen for drugs at any time they wish. They can tell the chairman of surgery, oh, today's your day, come right with me, and check you right then and there if they want to. And they don't have to have a reason. They can just do it. So I tell them, you know, marijuana is still an illegal drug in our nation, and you do not want to be caught with marijuana when you're in medical school or applying to medical school, because it's still illegal, no matter whether it's legal in Ohio or not. So they have to think about things like that. There are fee assistance programs for MCAS applications. Family income, if it's less than 400% of the federal poverty level, you see what it is up there. And those are the type of benefits that they'll give to applicants with low incomes. We do keep track of infractions, be it felonies, misdemeanors, institutional actions, investigative answers. Of interest is that no disclosure is legally required for any arrests that you've had, any charges that were ever filed, any not guilty verdicts, any overturned verdicts, if you were ever pardoned for an offense of which you were convicted. And in Ohio, minor misdemeanor drug violations do not have to be officially reported either on the application. So there are some interesting exceptions up there. Basically, if you've been convicted of a felony and don't fit one of those latter categories, you're not going to get into med school. Misdemeanors, maybe, but it's a big point against you. So how do we finally evaluate these applications? We look at three things, and we look at them equally: experiences, attributes, and metrics. When I got into med school, it was pretty much, what are your metrics, and are you from Ohio, and are you a man? And you would get into medical school. That certainly doesn't happen today. In general, we consider experiences that occur after high school. Rare that we'll consider high school experiences unless they are continued into college for some reason. And we're interested in activities that show those four things up there: your compassion for your fellow man, usually through service and volunteer activities; your leadership potential, both formal and informal; you're interested in experience with medicine, healthcare, and physicians; and your knowledge of the research process. That's what we care about in experiences, those four things. So what experiences do we actually want or advise of people to get? Well, the first category, community service. Yeah, sure.
Does the applicant know that these are the four?
I hope so. The opportunity is there for them to acquire that information. We have an actual course here at Ohio State for medical school applicants that about 100 students take every semester that I help teach, that teaches them how to apply to medical school. So, and it's online all the time as well. So they know it. They know it. Yeah. So experiences of community service, we'd like to see around 300 hours at a minimum. This is unpaid charitable service to others, both medical and non-medical. We'd like to see at least 300 hours of leadership experiences, such as even a TA or president of whatever club you were in, things like that. Research experience, and this is broad. It doesn't even have to be medicine. What we care about is you have learned about and understand the research process and why it's important in medicine. If you've gone way into it, gotten some posters or prize money for a publication, a first-person publication, that's a pretty rare treat, and that'll get you a maximum score in research. 300 hours of healthcare experiences is about what we like to see as well. Our typical applicant has about 60 hours of shadowing, though shadowing itself is not a necessity to get in if you have other types of experiences. A common one right now is scribing at medical practices as a way to get this experience. We care about you having seen what medicine is like, and particularly what a physician's practice and life are like to get into med school. We want to know you're going to keep at it and stay with it and not drop out of medical school. Yes, sir.
One of the four that are listed, or do you expect all four?
We expect all four.
Expect all?
All four. If you lack these things in any way, there are points deducted from your evaluation. Each of those four is 1/12 of your overall experience grade, and your, 1/4 of, I guess I'm not putting that in the right way. There are up to 3 points awarded for each one of those four categories, making a maximum of 12 points. But then there are other points awarded in the other two categories that we've talked about as well, attributes and metrics. So you'll see how that balances here. Sure.
Go back to slide before that. Relative to research, is there a hierarchy, for example, for example, quantitative, qualitative, legal, etc.?
Not really. We care that you have experience with the research process. That'll get you 1 point. The more hours, the more production you have in it, that'll up your point total. These are the experience types that AMCAS recognizes and that they can choose to label an experience with on their application. You'll notice intercollegiate athletics and hobbies are up there. We do take into account, say, Division I athlete in men's basketball at a Division I school like Ohio State. Takes a lot of time, and that reduces their opportunity for experiences. We give that some consideration in looking at the number of hours of experiences that they have. Hobby, if they turn out to be a dedicated black belt Taekwondo that does that regularly, well, that takes away time from potential experiences as well. All right, so experiences was 1/3 of your score. Now attributes, another third. There are three things we use for the attributes: the personal statement, the letters of evaluation, and the interview. Personal statement, I've kind of mentioned already. It's really not that hard, and you'd be amazed at how many people don't do well at it. They like to recount their experiences, and that's not what we're interested in. We want to know why you want to be a doctor, certainly that you want to be a doctor, and what led you to that decision. How did you arrive there? That's what we care about. You have to have letters of recommendation. 2 of them are required, one from a science professor, one from a non-science professor. We usually suggest 3 to 5, as well as avoiding family friends or family professional associates, which should be self-evident, but isn't always. And up to 10 are allowed. The problem with that is once you get beyond 5, you're really just increasing your chances of a negative letter. And 1 negative letter is all it takes to sink your application. Why? Because 99% of these letters are fabulous recommendations. 1% are bad. I'll show you what that looks like. There are different types of letters. I don't think I'm going to go over that with you. Here's a letter that we got one year. Most letters are 1 to 2 pages, typewritten in length. This one we got 2011. I've known so-and-so for 5 years. They took 5 biology courses. Her performance was adequate. Feel free to contact me. Why would I take a chance on somebody with this kind of letter when 99% of the others have fabulous recommendations? I don't know if this is real, unjustified, but why would I take the chance? I won't. It just doesn't work that way. Here's another one. A little longer, but look, the performance in the class was solid but not spectacular. Did not contribute much to class discussion. Why would I take a chance on someone like this when 99% of them don't say anything like that? I wouldn't. All right. So personal statement, the letters, and then the interview, if you're lucky enough to get an interview. The format varies by the school. Some schools use multiple short mini interviews. Most of us use longer, fewer interviews. Prior to the pandemic, everywhere in the country was done in person. Nobody did remote online interviews. I actually did OSU's first online interview in 2014. Yes, 2014. Somebody that was in Europe for the last year and couldn't leave, and we made special arrangements to do it. It was a very interesting experience, and I recommended we should consider doing it because it saves so much time and money for everybody. But of course, the schools won't hear of it then because this is their opportunity to sell the school to the interviewing student who comes to the school, right? And none of them wants to give up that competitive advantage to another school that still does it in person. That all changed with the pandemic. Now, all interviews are done online, usually via Zoom, everywhere in the country. It was an incredible change, and it's been a positive change. These interviews go very well. They're reliable. The students save time. They save a ton of money. Can you imagine going to 15 or 20 interviews? The time, the money involved in doing that. And who does that favor? Wealthier students. And that's not what we want. We want it to be equal. At OSU, you have a 45-minute interview by a faculty member of the medical school and a student, resident, or fellow in the medical school. We have a lot of students on our interviewing and deliberation committees. They are never a majority, but they are a significant minority, and they get a full equal vote, each one of them. So we have a lot of formats we go through, 0 to 3 scale for each factor. We look at all the things I've talked to you about, the kind of attributes we're looking for, their communication skills, critical thinking, resilience, self-awareness, collegiality, their service orientation. That's the kind of thing we're assessing by detailed questions and hearing their answers to them. We look at their metrics. We grade their GPA compared to everyone else. We grade their MCAT. And there are other factors that are a little more subjective. What undergrad school they went to, what kind of graduate or post-bac studies and grades they have, the strength of their letters. And a new one added this year is the SED score. We're going to talk about that. The GPA, we use the total GPA for their 3 to 4 years of undergraduate. We do use their science GPA for screening purposes. We don't care what your college major is. We don't pay any attention to it. We list it. Sometimes it might make a minor difference, you know, BME or neuroscience are really tough majors for undergraduates, and that kind of impresses people a little bit more. So maybe it makes a little difference, but by and large, if you majored in music and were the first violinist of the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra, that's just as impressive to us. And there was somebody like that who got in 10 years ago or so. So we like a wide variety of majors. Grade progression, we look at as well. A lot of people have trouble that freshman year in college because they're smart people. They did great in high school without any effort, and suddenly they're in college and they actually have to work and they didn't know that or how to do it. And they don't do well, and they eventually figure it out if they stayed around. The SED score, which we'll talk about. The MCAT that we've been using the last few years has 4 sections. You can see them up there. A couple of them are science related. The others are more about verbal and social indicators, which have become very important for us. 500 is used as the middle score. So it's self-regulating for the middle average, the 50th percentile. And it varies between 472 and 528. And we usually look at the percentiles, not the actual scores. So this is the report that we'll get back. You can see the percentile rank for each one of those areas there. And we'll use that total down there at the end, but we'll also look at individual ones to make sure there's no particular anomalies that we would be concerned about. There's a lot of controversies about the MCAT. The test fee is a lot. Advantages wealthier students, books, courses, coaches can cost $3,000 to $5,000. Obviously, advantages wealthier students. So that kind of leads to less diversity. Lower test scores are rejected more often, but as I'm going to show you, anybody who scores above the 50th percentile does equally well in medical school. And yet we favor people with 95th through 100th percentile. Why is that? Again, competition in the medical schools and reputation. So there's an impetus to do that. There are studies that show us that MCAT is not a great predictor, and your GPA is not a great predictor of how you're going to do in the US medical licensing exam, which has 3 parts to it. Parts 1 and 2 are usually taken in medical school. Part 1 after the 2nd year, part 2 after the 3rd or 4th year. Two parts to part 2, but I won't get into that. So some studies show really minor correlations with your performance in medical school and your GPA and your MCAT. But here's part of the problem: the median MCAT percentile for matriculants. Why do we have this difference? It appears that it's due to socioeconomic disparities. And I'm going to show you a chart that seems to show that. The MCAT doesn't seem to predict clinical excellence. It doesn't test for the most desired traits of empathy, forthrightness, and respect. And it's become a target instead of a good measure of who will make a good doctor. Confidence bands are wide, test retakes vary a lot. And we know that 98% of those with an MCAT over the 68th percentile will pass part 1 during medical school. So it's not a great measure of that. The part 1 after the 2nd year of medical school has now become pass-fail. So that makes the existence of your MCAT score less important in terms of passing part 1. The 60th percentile person passes it at the same rate as the 99th percentile because it's pass-fail at this point in time. Here's a relation between your total score and your step 1 scores. And you see it just varies completely. Your step 2 score after your clinical rotations, anybody that gets above that 50th percentile does great. You don't have to have a 90th percentile to be a great physician. So this year, Ohio State instituted the socioeconomic disadvantage score. Its intent is to provide an objective context on how to consider socioeconomic factors for an applicant, reduce bias and presumptions based on things like parental information. It's a race-neutral approach. It has no consideration whatsoever for race or ethnicity. It enables us to evaluate the academically qualified student across a wide range of SED scores. So basically what it does, it helps us equalize MCAT disadvantages. It is a type of class-based evaluation, which is perfectly legal in this country and has been ever since the 60s. Class was never instituted as a factor on which you could not discriminate. Interestingly enough, if you look at the history in the 60s and 70s, the liberal progressive community wanted to add class to the Civil Rights Act, and they were denied that opportunity. And because of that, class can now be used in a, quote, discriminatory fashion. So it's an interesting turn of the clock going back to that time. UC Davis has been doing this for many years, and most of the people in the country that have instituted this type of score use the criteria that UC Davis does. I'm not going to go into what they are, but they have to do with things like family income and growing up in rural areas and things like that. So this to me is one of the most interesting charts that I've ever seen. So here is, let me get out my green laser and see if that'll work better. Yeah. Here are the MCAT scores, okay? And then on this level are the actual scores here, the predicted scores, And then the SED scale is represented down here. So all you need to know is that the red scores are people in the 0 range with no socioeconomic disadvantage. People with blue scores have great socioeconomic disadvantage. The only common thing, look at this. All the reds are clustered at the high end of MCATs. All the blues are clustered at the low end, suggesting that your score on an MCAT is more related to your socioeconomic circumstances than it is to your academic prowess. That's an incredible chart to me. And it tells me that we've been relying too much on the actual percentile of MCATs instead of an adequate MCAT that'll make you a good doctor. Look at that. That's an incredible chart up there. I'm not going to go into the remedy proposals, but I will tell you what happened after the interview. After the interview is done, everything is submitted to the deliberation committee a few days later. We have 7 faculty and 5 students, residents, or fellows that review those applications in detail and debate them and vote on them. They're given a 1 to 5 score. They're added up and you get a decimal score at the end. 1 is superior, 2 is outstanding, 3 is strong, 4 is acceptable, 5 is red flag. Those who end up with a score in the 1 to 1.6 basically all get in. 1.6 to 2.2 is somewhat variable. A good percentage of them get in, possibly even a majority. And 2.3 to 4.0 are deferred. And I'll tell you what happens to the deferrals. And over 4.0, they're rejected, which is rare. Every 2 weeks, this committee meets and 20 new offers are extended every couple of weeks. We usually give acceptances for about 2 times the number of available spots. This is a highly statistical process with historical norms overseen by some of the statisticians at the university. We usually give about 350 acceptances for 170 spots through the regular interview program. There are separate pathways for the other programs, but they follow a similar process. By April 30th, applicants holding multiple acceptances have to declare for 1 school. And at that point, you usually are going to be below the number you want, and you start accepting people off your deferred list. We usually take about 100 people off of our 300-person deferred list. And that will be the end of how you get into medical school. So I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, you know why? Because they're my personal remedies that I've proposed.
So if there are remedies that are implemented, would they be at the Ohio State level or the national?
Well, they're debated at both levels. I have a little more influence at the Ohio State level. But right now, the biggest remedy is the SED score. We've used that significantly this year to understand why some applicants may not have as high an MCAT as others. And we use that to help equalize their chances at getting into med school. So far, I really like the process. We'll see how it plays out. Yes, sir.
About not being allowed. The socioeconomic disadvantage score addresses some of the concerns about not being allowed to use race and ethnicity. But it's my understanding that the research has shown that minority patients, especially Black patients, have better health outcomes when they have physicians of the same race or ethnicity. If that's correct, doesn't a public medical school have a responsibility to provide not just the best doctors, but the doctors that will be best for the population?
Great question. The answer to that right now is that the school has a greater responsibility to follow the law. And the law is we cannot use race or ethnicity in any decisions. And so we don't right now. Yes, sir.
I was wondering about students that have various kinds of handicaps. physically handicapped students, they certainly will not have those kinds of experiences that you listed there to that extent. And then how about students that are, I had one who was hard on hearing and wanted to go to medical school, and she was making a point that there are no doctors who can understand sign language.
Excellent question. What is the role of the admissions committee in evaluating physical disability of an applicant? The answer is 0. We are not allowed to consider any physical disability in an applicant's application. There is a committee that does that after they're accepted to medical school. And that committee determines whether their disability is bad enough to mean they can't perform the duties of a medical student and a physician. So there's a committee that looks into that. And their primary responsibility is to make accommodations for any physical disability that they may have. We have no consideration whatsoever for physical disabilities. We have a lot of students that tell us what their disability is when they're applying to med school. A lot of times that was their impetus for wanting to go to medical school and be a doctor. That's a lot. But we pay no attention to it. If I had a quadriplegic applying to medical school, I would give that 0 consideration. All I care about are his metrics, attributes, and experiences. Nothing about the physical attributes, but that is evaluated if they get accepted. Yes, sir.
Chart that you showed us with various amounts of time devoted to each of a group of attributes is a very.
Experiences, you mean?
Experiences.
Mhm.
And as I understood, you said that they had to fulfill all of those in terms of the number of hours?
So to get the maximum score, you need to have all of those, yes.
All of those with those number of hours?
And lesser scores, they have lesser fulfillment of
And
those.
what about a student, an undergraduate student who has to put in a significant amount of time working, in other words, to be able to go to college or university?
That's an entire question for us as well. We take good note of it. If we see that you had to work 2,000 hours over 4 years to be able to afford college, we absolutely consider that as time lost to experiences and compensate for that, similar to what we do with intercollegiate athletics.
And what about the student who has 0 research interest, but is very strong in all of the other attributes?
So they can get a maximum score that's 11/12 of the potential maximum score, which may be enough to get them into medical school. I think you saw that we had
600 hours for research.
Yeah, we had about 2 students who got in with no research experience. So it's possible, but you have to basically be perfect in everything else.
Interesting.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Statistics on the dropout?
Sure. I don't know of any statistics. I know of my personal experience. The question is about the dropout rate during medical school, right?
Yeah.
So on average, about 1 student per year maximum will drop out over the 4 years or be asked to drop out, almost always for professionalism issues. Very rarely for academic issues, although academic happens as well. If they can't pass part 1, they can't graduate from medical school. And that has happened a couple times that I know of. Julie?
Thanks, Mark. That was really interesting and thorough. I'm interested in part in how much the gender ratios have shifted, particularly over the last 50 years. And I was struck when you put up that second unsatisfactory letter, the one from Case Western Reserve. What was in the letter could be read as so many anti-young woman biases,
Or
right?
introvert bias even, right?
Both of those,
Mhm.
both of those. Do you find you ever have to correct, and is there a way for biases of the recommenders?
No. They're so rare to come up like that we are really unable to make any accommodation. What we do, and OSU is one of the few schools that offer this, anybody who applies to OSU and doesn't get in, we offer them the chance to meet with our executive director and be given some broad guidance as to why they didn't get in. Now, for instance, if the reason was a bad letter, we can't tell them who sent them the bad letter. What we can say is that your letters didn't seem to be adequate for what we were looking for, and you should think about that.
Could the person be encouraged to reapply in a few years, or is that?
Sure, they can be. Yeah, we'll tell them why they didn't get in. Maybe it was their MCAT score or their GPA. Whatever it was, we'll tell them what it was. And if they ask about how to remedy that, we'll tell them that too.
So is it fair to say it's relative to what it used to be a transparent process? I mean, obviously some parts of it are not.
It's relatively transparent. I think it's pretty transparent these days. There are perhaps a few things that are more subjective in the background. I mean, let's face it, the associate dean for admissions runs things, and they have a fair amount of leeway, but by and large, they're pretty committed to this transparent process of scores and the entire committee making decisions on who gets in and who doesn't. It really is only 10 years ago where we had to take someone the dean said take, or someone the president said take, or someone the $100 million donor said take. And that really wasn't fair. Although frankly, most of them might have gotten in on their own anyway.
One thing, Mark, we got a message from the chat. It appears as though a person would like to have the questions repeated so that they can be heard on the chat.
Oh, they're not hearing the microphone? Yeah. Okay. So questions up on the chat, shall I look at right now? Which one? Patrick? Hi, Patrick. Based on your experience, do you have any comments on the issues and questions the Ivy League schools are facing these days? Medical schools have worked through many of these issues. I wouldn't even want to take on the Ivy League school problems right now. I mean, I don't even know what area to start with. Legacy admissions are one of their big ones. We got rid of that. It hasn't been a big problem. But you know, these guys, they're really into their wealthy donors and wanting to make them happy. And I think they're prisoners of that philosophy. And I think it's not a great philosophy and they should stop it. That's my personal opinion. So they have a lot of issues, and that's the one that I've focused on the most lately.
Mark,
Yeah, Bill.
so, clearly a medical school is completely different than graduate program in our sciences, but, we've been on many committees. We have a bunch of qualitative and quantitative criteria that we look at and evaluate in a parallel way, perhaps, that you do. But in the end, success as a graduate student, in my view, comes down to work ethic and your imagination or innovation, which are not measurable quantities necessarily. You can maybe get a hint at them from letters. Are there intangibles like that that are important to being a successful medical student?
So work ethic is practically a given getting into medical school. I don't know if anybody gets into medical school that doesn't have a great work ethic. It's just sort of part of the driven personality. Even an introverted personality getting into medical school is driven. So I've never really had to question that. Creativity, imagination, not specifically assessed, mainly because we think all kinds are necessary. We need that logical, science-driven person who can sit in a pathology lab and not see patients and do a great job. We need the creative, charming people who relate well to patients on a personal level. We need all kinds. And I think that specialty choice in medicine is primarily a function of the individual's personality and what they're attracted to. And you know what? We don't assess that, and yet somehow it works out. The right number of people go into the right specialties. A few specialties are more competitive than others, but by and large, the student personalities match into the right personalities. On rare occasions, they choose wrong and then they end up having to go back and start over again, but that's pretty rare. It's all about personality matching, I think. Yes, one more up in the back.
Well, given that diversity is important, I have two-pronged questions. One is that the committee that considers these applications, is that, in your opinion, is the committee usually diverse racially to consider applications from all different racial minorities? And the second question is that I really didn't get a good idea from your presentation, which was excellent, but I didn't get a concrete idea as to how does race come into does the race play a role in the admission? Is there an attempt to get racially balanced admission of
Not
this year's
anymore.
or next year's
There
class?
used to be an attempt. Ohio State was pretty racially diverse and ethnically diverse, reflecting close to what the national statistics are for population. But that's not in consideration anymore whatsoever. What that will mean in terms of our eventual numbers, and we do keep track of those numbers, by the way. It's just that people on the admissions committee are not allowed to see any of those kind of numbers because it's not a consideration whatsoever anymore. In terms of the faculty and the students, pretty random. It's a well-balanced ethnic and racial faculty on the admissions committee. The associate dean for admissions is a Black woman at this time, was a Black man before that, a white man before that. It's been pretty diverse, and they basically, I think, are looking for the best people, as well as people that have the time to do a good job. So I don't think that's a problem, but I understand you would think that it could be, and it certainly could. I have not seen a problem at all. Julia.
About the process with respect to gender, ethnic, and racial diversity that you would change if it were possible to?
Right now? No, I don't think so. The biggest problem right now is we're having trouble getting the men's percentage up to 50%.
That's a national issue.
It is a national issue. It's something that we are concerned about, but we're not really. So gender is not quite in the same class as race and ethnicity. It's a semi-protected class. And so if there's a reason to balance that, we are still allowed to do so to a small degree. It's difficult, all right? But we do worry about that. We don't want to happen to medicine what's happened to dentistry and veterinary school. Dentistry is still 90% male, and veterinary school is 90% female. And I don't know that that's a good balance. More questions? How long can we go, Jack? 5 more minutes anyway? All right.
How do the students, fellows, residents, et cetera, and faculty be chosen to be on this committee? What is the process?
Basically, they have to volunteer, and then the associate dean for admissions chooses them. I don't know how she chooses them. My personal observation is that anybody that volunteers gets on the committee. Because we need 100 people easily on this committee. We do a lot of work, as you can imagine, with 7,000 applications.
Thank you. This has been very enlightening. My question is there any type of national organization where you, for instance, might be a speaker and other institutions could send their representatives and say, gee whiz, look what Ohio State is doing. Should we consider something like that?
Oh, yeah, there's speakers for this all the time. I'm just a small cog in the machine. I don't really.
Organization, though.
There are organizations that are involved with this. AMCAS is the primary one. There are workshops on this all the time over the country. People that have innovative programs like UC Davis in terms of socioeconomic disadvantage, lecture on it all the time, publish articles on it. The information is shared out there. A lot of the problem is getting the information to undergraduates who want to apply to medical school, which is why I'm very proud of the course that we have here at Ohio State. Dr. Saurabh Khandelwal, who's an emergency physician here at Ohio State, started this course some years ago and still runs it twice a year, one class each semester, 100 students. And I lecture at it usually about 3 times a semester. And these students get great information that really puts them at an advantage in applying to medical school compared to people that don't have good advice and mentoring. So there are things that can be done to improve people's applications. All right, one last question and then we'll call it a day, except for one on the chat as well. So right after you, we'll do one more up on the chat.
Does the medical school and the admissions process have to adjust due to demand or need for physicians or medical doctors? Or is it a relatively constant inflow every year?
Yeah, it's pretty much a constant inflow and outflow. The number of medical students is pretty much dependent on the number of residency training spots. Residency training spots depend on government and hospital funding, which it's a combination. So if the government says we need more doctors, they'll give the hospitals more money to train them. If they say we need fewer, they give them less money and the slots go down. Sometimes it happens that different specialties have fewer or greater demands for their service, and the hospitals may expand those residencies and apply for more money to do it or put the money up on their own. There's a lot of funding mechanisms, but the medical schools are pretty stable. The thing that you see different is new schools coming online or rarely old schools going defunct. A lot of schools do try to expand their numbers as the demand for doctors rises. But frankly, right now, the demand is greater in certain specialties, but overall not that great because of the rise of the role of nurse practitioners and physician associates. It's a very controversial topic among physicians right now. So the numbers are pretty stable over the years for medical school admissions. And up top, how much time does service on the admissions committee take? When you serve on it, you agree to do 2 sessions per month for 8 months of the year, September through March. Usually you have to divide your time between interviews and deliberation. Interviews take about an hour to an hour and a half of preparation, an hour and 45 minutes of interviewing, and another hour to write them up on the day that you do an interview. Deliberation takes an hour of preparation and 3 hours, 2 to 3 hours of deliberation on the day you agree to do it. And you do this twice a month for 8 months, if that helps you know. So it's a significant commitment. The reason I still do this 7 years into retirement, 8 years into retirement, it feels worthwhile. It seems worthwhile to choose who are going to be the doctors that follow me in practice and to make sure they're the right kind of people that you want taking care of myself, my parents, my children, my wife. I really care about that, and this seems to be a way to make a difference in that project. Thank you all for coming.